He had billions in the bank, but not a single soul he could trust. After being betrayed by his secretary and deceived by his fiancée, billionaire Peter Grayson sets one final trap: a test of loyalty, disguised as drunken vulnerability. But when his quiet, unnoticed maid passes with grace and honesty, her kindness doesn't just shock him. It changes everything. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The city skyline glittered in the distance like a crown of stars. From the top floor of the Grayson Tower, a sprawling glass monolith that pierced the clouds, Peter Grayson stood in his penthouse office, whiskey glass in hand, staring at everything and feeling absolutely nothing. Outside, the world moved to the rhythm of his empire. Cars, people, transactions, decisions, all dancing to the tune of his power. Peter could, with a single phone call, sway stock markets or close multimillion-dollar deals. His name alone was enough to open doors that most could only dream of knocking on. And yet, here he stood alone, haunted not by failure, but by success that came with a hidden curse: isolation. His office, vast and modern, was a reflection of his persona: cold steel, polished marble, muted tones, and the subtle hum of soft jazz playing in the background. A place built for kings, but ruled by a prisoner of his own paranoia. He glanced down at his desk. A sleek black frame held a photo from 5 years ago, his father's funeral. It was the last time he cried. Since then, Peter had built walls around his emotions as impenetrable as the security systems that guarded his estate. Trust. That word. That elusive, fragile thing. It had become the hardest currency in his world, rarer than oil, gold, or diamonds. He had learned early that the richer he became, the harder it was to know who cared for him, and who cared only for his money. He sipped the whiskey. Single malt, 30 years aged. It burned down his throat, but the fire didn't reach his heart. Not anymore. Business partners had betrayed him, smiling to his face, stabbing from behind. Investors pretended to believe in his vision, only to use him as a stepping stone. Even friends from his youth had quietly vanished or come crawling back when the headlines made his fortune public. And relationships? A joke. Romantic interests turned out to be gold diggers wrapped in charm. He learned to spot the fake compliments, the way they laughed too hard at his jokes, how their eyes always drifted toward the watch on his wrist or the keys to his car. A man like him didn't get love. He got transactions dressed up as affection. He turned away from the glass, walking slowly to his bookshelf. Rows of biographies lined the shelves: Musk, Jobs, Rockefeller. Stories of men who conquered the world. But none told the story of what they lost in the process. Peter often wondered if they, too, had felt this strange hollowness, this disconnection. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a notebook. Leather-bound, untouched by assistants. Inside were pages of scribbled thoughts, plans, reflections, things he couldn't say out loud. Tonight's entry was simple. I need someone beside me. Not for business. Not for appearances. Just someone who truly gives a damn. Someone who would care if I disappeared tomorrow. He closed the book slowly, placing it back in the drawer with care, as if sealing away a secret too dangerous to be spoken. There had to be someone. Surely, somewhere in his orbit, amidst the meetings, the staff, the entourage, someone existed who wasn't pretending. Who saw him, not just the billionaire brand. He walked to the bar again, refilled the glass, but this time he didn't drink. Instead, an idea formed, raw, unconventional, and reckless. If the world kept giving him fakes, maybe it was time to test for something real. The night was quiet, but Peter's mind wasn't. After pouring himself another drink that he had no intention of finishing, he stood in front of the floor-length mirror in his walk-in closet. His reflection stared back at him, tailored suit still. Crisp, jaw clenched, eyes tired but calculating. Tonight, he wouldn't be the billionaire. He would be a broken version of himself, vulnerable, messy, inconvenient. A version most people never got to see. And that was the point. If he wanted to find someone who truly cared, he had to give them a chance to prove it, when there was nothing to gain. He left the closet and made his way back into the penthouse living room, dimming the lights and opening a bottle of cheap bourbon for effect. It wasn't his usual drink. He wanted the smell, the mess, the spectacle. He took a few sips, swirled some around in his mouth, and then poured a bit onto his shirt. The alcohol stained the pristine white cotton. He undid 2 buttons and staggered just enough to look believably drunk. Then he picked up his phone. First on the list, Mia Caldwell, his executive secretary. Brilliant. Composed. She'd been with him for 2 years, flawlessly managing his calendar, organizing his life, and shielding him from corporate chaos. She was sharp, ambitious, and always 2 steps ahead. He pressed her contact and hit call. "Mr. Grayson?" She answered promptly, voice crisp even though it was almost midnight. "I need you to come by the penthouse," he slurred. "Something's wrong." A pause. "You sound. Are you all right?" "Just come," he muttered and hung up. He didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes later, the private elevator dinged and Mia stepped into the room, dressed in a sleek black pencil skirt and blouse, her heels clicking across the marble floor. She looked around cautiously. "Sir?" Peter stumbled out from behind the couch, pretending to lose balance, and collapsed onto the floor. "I'm messed up. Everything's falling apart. I needed someone, anyone." Mia sighed audibly. "Are you drunk?" He nodded, eyes glassy, slurring his words. "Can't do this anymore." She didn't move to help. Instead, she set down her handbag and crossed her arms. "This is highly inappropriate, sir. You're the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. Do you realize what kind of scandal this could cause?" Peter groaned, feigning dizziness, expecting, hoping, for some sign of concern. Mia checked her phone. "I really don't have time for this. I've got an early conference call with the Tokyo office." She stepped over him, walked toward the bar, grabbed a glass of water, and set it down half-heartedly on the table. Then she looked down at him, not with empathy, but with thinly veiled frustration. "You should sleep this off. I'm not your babysitter." With that, she picked up her bag and walked out, the elevator doors closing behind her with a metallic hiss. Peter sat up slowly, wiping the fake slur from his voice, his expression unreadable. A part of him had hoped she would fail. Another part had hoped she wouldn't. But the result was the same. She was out. The next night he tried again. This time with someone even closer. Vanessa Blake, socialite model, and his fiancée of 6 months. Their relationship had always been glossy and convenient. She was beautiful, articulate, and camera-friendly. They were the talk of every luxury magazine. Power couple of the year. But Peter knew better than to trust photographs. She arrived at the penthouse that evening expecting dinner. Instead, she found Peter sprawled across the floor, whiskey bottle in hand, eyes glazed. She stood in the doorway, blinking. "What the hell, Peter?" "I can't do this anymore," he slurred again. "The company, it's all falling apart." Vanessa's stilettos clicked loudly as she walked toward him, not with concern, but exasperation. "Are you drunk? On a Wednesday? What's wrong with you?" "I needed someone." She scoffed. "You needed someone to clean up your mess, you mean?" She didn't help him up. She didn't sit beside him. Instead, she pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. "For insurance," she said coldly. "In case you decide to implode and drag me down with you." Peter remained limp, his heart pounding with something much darker than disappointment. He wasn't surprised. He was sickened. Vanessa stood over him, shaking her head. "Grow up, Peter. You think the world cares if you're tired? You think your money means anything when you're acting like this? People respect you because you don't fall apart. Don't mess that up." She left without looking back. Peter waited until he heard the elevator door shut before sitting up again, the coldness in his chest blooming into something heavier. Not just betrayal, but clarity. That was it. 2 people. 2 chances. 2 failures. He walked back into his office, opened his leather notebook again, and scratched 2 names off a short, private list. There was only one left. Someone he'd never considered before. But maybe, just maybe, He picked up the pen and circled the final name, Stella. His maid. The one person in his house who never smiled too wide, never asked for favors, never overstepped. Always quiet. Always watching. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and looked toward the hallway where her quarters were. Tomorrow night. The final test. The last chance to find something real. Peter barely slept that night. He lay in his vast, king-sized bed staring at the ceiling as the slow, rhythmic glow of the city pulsed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. There was no peace in luxury. No comfort in expensive linens or the silence of a fortress-like home. His mind turned restlessly, rehearsing how he would stage the final test. This time, it wasn't a secretary with a salary at stake. It wasn't a fiancé who stood to gain social elevation. It was Stella, someone who moved so quietly through his world, most guests never even knew she was there. In fact, Peter realized he barely knew her himself. Stella had joined his household staff nearly a year ago through an agency. She'd never asked for anything. She never fawned or flattered. She didn't linger or insert herself into conversations. Her presence was like soft background music, consistent, calming, but never demanding attention. Her job was to clean, organize, and occasionally cook if the chef was away. And yet, in the weeks since his father's anniversary, he'd noticed her more. The way she left small, folded notes beside his teacup if something had run out. The way she turned down the lights and adjusted the curtains just enough to give him privacy without suffocating darkness. She wasn't invisible, she was intentional. Still, Peter needed proof. Not intuition. Action. So he set the stage. That afternoon, while Stella was out shopping for household supplies, he returned early and carefully unlatched the locks on his travel briefcase. The one he always kept sealed with financial documents, rare watch collections, and stacks of emergency cash. It was heavy, black, and looked expensive because it was. He set it beside the armchair in his bedroom, positioned just awkwardly enough to fall open with the right nudge. Then he took off his tie, ruffled his shirt, and changed into a more casual look. Linen pants, unbuttoned shirt, no shoes. He needed to look like a man unraveling. By 9 p.m., he turned off most of the lights and poured a mix of apple cider vinegar and water into a whiskey bottle. The scent was sour and sharp, convincing enough to reek of alcohol without a drop of liquor actually in his system. He practiced the stumble down the hall, the lean against the wall, the muttered slurs under his breath. Then he waited. At 9:17, he heard the elevator chime in the service wing. Stella was back. Soft footsteps padded down the hallway, followed by the rustle of grocery bags. Peter gave it a few minutes. He heard her humming, softly, distantly, maybe putting things away in the kitchen. Then he staggered out. Stella, he mumbled, barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. He leaned harder into the wall and made his way toward the living room. She appeared around the corner, dressed in her uniform. No makeup, no jewelry, her hair tied loosely behind her in a braid. She looked at him, eyes widening slightly. "Sir?" she asked, concern knitting her brow. I had a bit too much," he muttered, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. "Just rough night." Without hesitation, Stella rushed to his side and slipped her shoulder under his arm. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you to bed." He let himself sag against her, testing, but not making her struggle. She guided him slowly through the hallway, pausing when he winced and feigned nausea. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "You didn't sign up for this." "I take care of the house," she said simply. "Tonight, that includes you." Her voice wasn't motherly. It wasn't submissive. It was kind, firm, present. They reached his bedroom. She sat him on the edge of the bed, then removed his shoes one by one, setting them neatly beside the nightstand. She glanced at his shirt, wrinkled and stained. "Would it be all right if I helped you out of this?" she asked softly. He nodded, and she carefully unbuttoned his shirt, averting her eyes as she pulled it off his shoulders. Then she grabbed a small towel from the bathroom, dampened it, and returned, dabbing gently at his neck and hands. The cool cloth brushed his skin like a whisper. She didn't speak, didn't pry, just tended to him as if he were no different than the floors she mopped or the mirrors she polished. Not because he was her boss, but because he was human. "There," she said, pulling the blankets over his chest. "Try to sleep. I'll be close by if you need anything." And then, the moment Peter had prepared for, she noticed the briefcase. It had shifted slightly in all the commotion. Just enough that when she stepped past it to grab a spare pillow, her foot caught the edge. Thud. The case hit the ground. The latch popped open, and out spilled more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Stacks of $100 bills, wrapped in tight bands, slid across the floor like scattered cards from a high-stakes game. It was a surreal sight. Cold. Raw. Tempting. Stella froze. Peter, under the covers with eyes half-lidded, kept utterly still, his pulse quickening. She stared at the money, her breath caught in her throat. He saw her lips part slightly, the flicker of 1,000 thoughts dancing behind her eyes. He waited, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she knelt down. One by one, she picked up each bundle, aligning them neatly with gentle care, brushing off any dust. She returned them to the case without even glancing around the room to see if anyone was watching. As she closed the lid, her hand paused briefly over the lock. Then click. Secured. She slid the briefcase into its place beside the armoire and straightened. Turning toward the bed, she whispered, "Sleep well, Mr. Grayson." She picked up the damp tile and quietly stepped out of the room, shutting the door with a soft click. Peter lay in silence for a long time. The air was heavy, but not with disappointment. With awe. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his head, the ruse now fully broken. "She passed," he whispered to the empty room. His voice was steady, certain, weighted. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like years, Peter Grayson felt the first real flicker of something rare and powerful. Hope. The silence after Stella closed the door seemed to hum with clarity. Peter remained seated on the edge of his bed, the sheets loosely draped around his waist, the scent of damp cloth and vinegar-stained whiskey still lingering faintly in the air. The light from the hallway crept in under the door, casting a thin golden line across the hardwood floor. The briefcase sat where she had placed it, locked, unblemished, untouched. It wasn't the money she returned that stayed with him. It was the care with which she returned it. Not rushed. Not panicked. No glance over her shoulder. She had picked up each bundle like it wasn't just money, but something fragile, something that belonged to someone she respected. Peter rubbed his hands over his face. He wasn't tired. He was stunned. He had expected restraint, maybe. But not that. Not the gentleness. The dignity. He pulled the comforter off, walked across the room, and bent down to examine the briefcase. Still latched. Still full. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked barefoot to his private study and flicked on the low desk lamp. Shadows stretched across the bookshelves and the dark-paneled walls. The same leather notebook sat waiting for him, like a trusted confidant. He opened it to the short list, 3 names. 2 crossed out. Mia. Vanessa. Only 1 name remained unmarked. He took the pen, paused above the line, and instead of crossing it out, he drew a circle. Not an ending. A beginning. The next morning, the penthouse stirred before dawn. Automatic blinds rose in slow unison, casting the first light of sunrise across glass and steel. Stella, as always, was already awake. Peter watched her on the surveillance monitor from his office, not out of paranoia, but curiosity. He saw her moving between rooms in quiet rhythm, watering the small orchid in the corner of the living room, straightening cushions that barely needed straightening, checking the stock in the guest bar fridge. She wore the same clothes. No jewelry, no pretense. Her hair was tied up again, neat, no fuss. A woman at peace with being invisible. And yet today she wouldn't be. At precisely 7:03 a.m., he called down through the intercom. "Stella." There was a pause. "Yes, sir? Come to the main office. Please." He could hear the hesitation in her voice before she replied. "Right away." She entered the study a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a folded towel she'd been using to polish a vase. Her eyes found him standing by the tall windows, back straight, arms crossed. He looked different this morning, focused, intense, but not unkind. "You needed something, Mr. Grayson?" "Yes," he said without turning around. "But not what you're thinking." She waited. He finally turned. "I owe you the truth." That got her attention. Her posture stiffened slightly, hands still loosely holding the towel. "About last night," he said. She glanced down, uncertain. "I didn't mean to overstep. I just thought you needed help." "You didn't overstep," he interrupted gently. "You saved me. Or at least, you showed me something I didn't think still existed." She blinked, unsure what to say. He stepped closer. "I faked it, Stella. The drinking. The breakdown. The briefcase." He said it slowly, clearly, his eyes locked on hers. It was all a test. There was silence between them, thick and stretching. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Instead, after a few moments, she said, "Okay." Peter tilted his head, studying her reaction. "You're not angry?" "No," she said simply. "Just surprised. Most people would be offended." "I'm not most people," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. Clearly, he moved to the desk and opened a drawer. From it, he retrieved a dark blue folder and held it out to her. She stepped forward and accepted it, glancing down at the label. Confidential onboarding, executive assistant role. Her eyes lifted back to him in confusion. "I'm offering you a new position," he said. "One that pays 5 times what you make now. With full benefits, travel opportunities, your own office on the executive floor, and full access to every part of my operation." She stared at him. "Why me?" "Because you passed when others failed," he said, voice unwavering. "Because you had every chance to take what didn't belong to you and didn't. Because when I pretended to be weak, you didn't take advantage, you took care." Her hands tightened slightly on the folder. "I don't know anything about business," she admitted. "You'll learn. I'll teach you everything." She paused. "You trust me that much?" He took a step closer. "You didn't steal my money. You didn't exploit my vulnerability. And you didn't hesitate to help someone you thought was beneath his own dignity." "Yes, Stella. I trust you more than anyone I've trusted in years." A long silence hung between them, thick with a new energy, something still unnamed. Finally, she looked down at the folder again, then up at him. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "If you're sure." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As she left the room, folder in hand, Peter turned back toward the window. The city was fully awake now. Traffic buzzed below. Skyscrapers glinted in the rising sun. Another day, another billion-dollar decision ahead. But none would compare to the one he had just made. This wasn't just a test of character. It was the moment the walls began to fall. And the beginning of something he didn't know he'd been searching for. Not just loyalty, not just honesty, but the first bricks of trust. The next few days moved like quiet ripples in a deep, still lake. Nothing dramatic. No grand announcement. No sudden shift in the air. But something had changed. Stella felt at the moment she stepped into the building's executive wing for the first time. Not as a maid, not through the service corridor, but through the front elevator, escorted personally by Peter's head of security. She wasn't in uniform anymore. She wore a navy blouse and a modest pencil skirt, simple heels, and her hair tied neatly in a bun. No one recognized her. No one whispered. But there was a quiet awareness in her steps, a question she kept asking herself with every click of her heels. "Do I belong here?" That question didn't fade when she entered the executive suite. Peter was already there, seated behind a wide, minimalist desk made of smoked glass and steel. He looked up from a file and smiled, genuine, not performative. "You're early," he said. "I'm used to starting before sunrise," Stella replied, her voice composed, but her hands were gripping the strap of her leather tote just a bit too tightly. Peter noticed. "Relax," he said, rising from his chair. "No one expects you to run the company by Friday." She allowed herself a small smile. He gestured toward the side of the office, where a sleek door stood slightly ajar. "That's your space." She stepped into it slowly. Her new office was smaller than his, but still spacious. A glass desk with a new laptop. A touchscreen calendar monitor mounted to the wall. Shelves still empty. "I thought you might like some continuity," he said, watching her silently admire the flower. Her chest swelled with emotion she didn't expect. Continuity, not transformation. He wasn't asking her to become someone else. He was bringing her forward as she was. "I don't know what to say," she said softly. "Don't say anything," Peter replied. "Just learn. Just observe. Just grow." And she did. The days that followed, Stella began sitting in on meetings. At first quietly, just observing, taking notes. She watched Peter as he shifted between roles: CEO, negotiator, strategist, visionary. He was different in the boardroom. Controlled, calculating, precise. There was no hesitation in him when it came to business. But there was also something missing in the room, an energy that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with perspective. That's where Stella came in. It started small. She'd raise a hand after a meeting and ask, "Why do we work with that vendor? Their prices seem marked up compared to regional competitors." Peter checked. She was right. Another day, she noticed a presentation meant for international clients used idioms and references that didn't translate well culturally. She rewrote it overnight. The revised version closed the deal. Slowly, the others around the table, executives who once raised brows at her presence, began to listen when she spoke. Even Peter found himself turning toward her mid-discussion. "Stella, thoughts?" And she always had them. Not because she knew the answers, but because she asked the right questions. It was in the quiet moments, too. Late evenings when they were the last two in the office. Peter would remove his tie and loosen his collar, while Stella sipped tea, barefoot now, heels long abandoned under her desk. They talked about more than just numbers. He asked about her life before the penthouse. She told him about growing up with a single mother, the years spent working odd jobs, cleaning houses during the day, taking night classes she never finished. She never expected anything more. She wasn't bitter, just grateful to have survived. He listened, really listened. No interruptions. No judgment. One night, he opened up in return. "My father used to say, 'Money is power, son.' But trust? That's divine." I never understood what he meant. Not until recently. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. They both knew. It wasn't long before questions surfaced outside the office. Paparazzi snapped blurry photos of the mysterious woman arriving with Peter at charity galas. Online forums buzzed. "Who's the woman beside Grayson?" Rumors flew. But Stella never answered. She didn't post. She didn't dress for the cameras. She showed up. She worked. She added value. And slowly, the media lost interest when there was no scandal to feast on. But within the company, her name began to carry weight. "Stella wants to review the proposal first." Stella flagged an error in the contract. "Stella's joining the call, be prepared." The staff stopped referring to her as the maid who got lucky. Now, she was Ms. Stella Brooks, executive advisor to the CEO. They were in Tokyo for a strategic alliance meeting. The room was full of tension: lawyers, interpreters, advisors. Peter was holding firm on a deal that could open their company to Asian markets in an unprecedented way. But the foreign team wasn't budging on a key clause. The discussion hit a wall. Peter leaned back, sighing. "Let's break for 10. In the hallway, he turned to Stella. "I'm missing something, aren't I?" She nodded. "Their culture is built on harmony. You're being too direct. It's not about the numbers. It's about saving face. You're cornering them in front of their subordinates." He looked at her, stunned. Then, without hesitation, he said, "You lead the next session." She blinked. "What? You've earned it. Go." She did. With poise, respect, and diplomacy, she reopened the conversation in a softer tone. She asked questions, offered alternatives, gave them a chance to feel heard without giving up any real ground. By the end of the meeting, the deal was signed. Peter watched from the corner, silent, proud. And as they exited the building, Walking through a quiet garden of cherry blossoms, he turned to her. "You're not just part of the business anymore," he said. "You're part of the vision." Stella didn't respond right away. She stared at the trees swaying gently in the wind, then looked up at the man beside her, the billionaire who had tested her humanity and then handed her a new life when she passed. "I don't know what we're building," she said, "but I know it's real." And for the first time in years, Peter smiled, not the polite one he wore for investors, not the smirk he gave reporters. A real smile. He extended his hand, not as a CEO, not as a man seeking loyalty, but as someone offering partnership. Side by side, they walked forward. Into business. Into legacy. Into something neither of them could yet name. There's a language that exists between people who've shared something sacred. Not through words, but through presence. Through silence. Through showing up when no one else does. That was the language Peter and Stella began to speak fluently. It had been 6 months since she stepped out of the shadows of housekeeping and into the gleaming light of boardrooms, press conferences, and global negotiations. And yet, Stella remained fundamentally unchanged. She still arrived early, long before the office buzzed with life. She still brought herbal tea instead of coffee. Still kept a small stack of hand lotion bottles in her drawer, because long meetings made her palms dry. Still smiled at janitors and interns the same way she did with shareholders. But her world had changed. She was now known not just as the assistant or the advisor, but the woman who saved the Tokyo deal. Her face was discreetly recognized at airport lounges, nodded at in exclusive circles, discussed in industry whispers. Her office, once filled with blank shelves and an untouched orchid, was now warm with life. Photos of landscapes she'd seen on their business travels, post-it notes covered in half-scribbled ideas, books on negotiation and finance that she read late into the night. And Peter? He began to change too. Stella didn't just help Peter's business grow. She helped him grow. She challenged him, not with arrogance, but with honesty. She'd stop him mid-sentence during strategy meetings if his tone got too cold. She'd gently reword his emails before they were sent, not because they were wrong, but because they could be kinder. At first, he resisted. "You're softening everything," he once argued, pacing across his office. "I'm humanizing it," she replied calmly, standing her ground. And over time, Peter began to see that compassion and power weren't opposites. They were complements. He started to listen more. Not just to her, but to others. He started walking through the lower floors of his company, learning names. He began asking not only what his employees were doing, but how they were doing, because Stella had reminded him of something crucial. People aren't assets. They're the reason the company exists at all. Despite their professional rhythm, there were still moments Peter faltered. Some days, he'd shut down mid-conversation. A word or a gesture would pull him into a memory, an old betrayal, a business deal gone south, a friend he once trusted who sold him out for a press leak. And Stella would never pry. She wouldn't ask what was wrong. She'd just leave a cup of tea on his desk and let the silence stretch between them like a soft blanket. No pressure. No expectation. One afternoon, after a tense investor call, Peter remained in his chair long after everyone left. His jaw was locked, fingers steepled in front of his mouth. Stella didn't say anything. She simply walked over, gently removed his glasses, and set them beside him. Then, she reached for the remote and turned off the fluorescent lights, leaving only the warm glow of his desk lamp. He looked up at her, exhausted, eyes searching hers for something even he couldn't name. "You don't ask questions," he said finally. She shrugged. "You talk when you're ready. And if I never am, then I'll sit quietly until you are." A beat. He nodded just once. Rumors came, as they always do. A tabloid headline read, "Peter Grayson's mystery woman. New romance or corporate puppet?" Stella saw it before he did and deleted the email alert from his inbox. But when he eventually found out, he asked her over dinner in Hong Kong. Half joking, half curious. "Are we giving people the wrong idea?" Stella sipped her tea, unfazed. "People will always want to name things they don't understand. He studied her face, still calm, still steady. "And what are we?" he asked. She looked out the window, where the city lights of Victoria Harbor shimmered like stars spilled into the water. "We're the only thing in your life that doesn't need a label to matter," she said softly. "Isn't that enough?" And for once, Peter didn't feel the need to define it. Because she was right. They weren't lovers. They weren't just colleagues. They were something rare. A partnership built on raw, honest connection. Sometimes their hands would brush when they exchanged documents, and both would pretend not to notice. Sometimes he'd look at her across a conference table filled with executives, and she'd raise a brow at him with that quiet challenge she always carried. Sometimes, late at night, she'd find a sticky note on her desk with nothing but his handwriting. "Thank you for showing up." She never replied, but she always kept the notes. The two of them were returning from a meeting downtown when the skies opened into a heavy downpour. The car pulled up to the private entrance, but Peter stepped out first without waiting for the driver's umbrella. "Stella, wait inside," he called, motioning to her from the rain. But she followed him out anyway. He turned, ready to protest, only to see her already soaked, hair flattened against her cheeks, her blouse clinging to her skin. Her laugh, the first real, open laugh he'd ever heard from her, rang through the thunder. "You're rich, Peter, not made of sugar," she said with a grin. Something inside him broke open. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Just a quiet cracking. A moment. He laughed too. They stood there in the rain for a few seconds longer than necessary. Not talking. Not moving. Just two people caught in the same storm, both realizing they didn't mind getting wet, as long as the other was beside them. Back inside, they dried off in silence, sipping warm tea in the kitchen, sitting barefoot at the marble island like old friends. There were no confessions, no declarations, just presence, just peace. By now, Peter no longer doubted her. He trusted her with his calendar, his passwords, his estate, and quietly his heart. And Stella no longer questioned whether she belonged. She knew she did. Not because he said it, but because he showed it. Every single day. In quiet gestures. In shared glances. In things left unsaid, but never unfelt. They were still building something. They didn't know what it was yet. But whatever it became, it had already changed them both. Forever. It started like any other morning. The city below was yawning itself awake, a slow churn of lights, traffic, and movement. The sky was watercolor gray, streaked with pale gold, the kind of morning that promised something, but didn't say what. Inside the Grayson Tower, the executive suite was quiet. Stella stepped into her office at 6:42 a.m., her usual time. She wore a tailored cream blouse, charcoal gray slacks, and a pair of flat shoes she had bought from a street market in Italy. Unassuming but comfortable. Her hair was pulled back loosely. She looked like someone who belonged in the world she had helped build. And yet, today something felt different. A folded envelope lay on her desk. Heavy paper. Gold seal. Her name written in Peter's handwriting. Just her first name. Not Ms. Brooks. Not Stella. Just Stella. She opened it slowly, half expecting a business itinerary. But it wasn't that. Inside was a single sheet of linen paper. No date. No salutation. Just a line. "Where were you exactly 1 year ago tonight?" She stared at the question, confused. Then she remembered. The night she helped him into bed. The night he tested her. The night everything changed. When she entered Peter's office, he wasn't at his desk. The room was dark, the blinds still closed, the air still, the only light a single flickering candle on the coffee table by the windows. And beside it, the briefcase. The briefcase. The same one that had spilled its secrets across his bedroom floor a year ago. This time, it was open intentionally. But instead of cash, it was filled with memories. Photos. Newspaper clippings. A napkin from their first shared dinner in Rome. A folded boarding pass from Tokyo. The broken watch she had once retrieved from a hotel suite after Peter forgot it. And on top of everything, the leather notebook. The one she had never seen but had always suspected existed. She stepped closer, hesitating. Her fingertips brushed the cover. Inside were names. Dozens. Some crossed out, some circled. But on the very last page, only one name appeared, written in ink so dark and deliberate it seemed engraved into the paper itself. Stella. Not tested. Not trusted. Just known. She stared at the words for a long time, heart thudding. A soft rustle behind her. She turned. Peter stood in the doorway, dressed simply in dark jeans, a white shirt, barefoot. The closest he had ever looked to human in his own castle. "I was going to write a speech," he said quietly, walking in. "But that letter felt more like us." She said nothing, just watched him. He moved closer. "Do you remember what I said that night?" he asked. She nodded. She passed. "I meant it," he said. "But it was incomplete. Because you didn't just pass. You redefined the test." He took a breath. "I spent years building walls. Gold-plated, bulletproof, high enough to keep the world out. But you," his voice softened, "you never tried to break them down. You just sat outside until I opened the door." Stella felt her throat tighten. "I didn't know what we were at first," he continued. "You weren't like anyone else. You didn't flatter. You didn't chase. You didn't ask for anything." He reached out and took her hand, not hesitantly, but reverently. "And that's how I knew you were everything." He didn't kneel. There was no ring. No grand performance. Just a man offering his life, not as a prize, but as a place, somewhere she could belong if she wanted to. "I don't want an assistant," he said. "Or a partner. Or an advisor." He stepped closer. "I want you. Every version of you. The quiet one. The fierce one. The one who cleaned my floors and the one who rewrote my contracts. The one who asked for nothing and gave me everything I didn't know I needed." Tears brimmed in her eyes. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she had known. Deep down, for months, she had felt it, the shift, the slow, deliberate heartbeat between them that had become louder with every shared silence. "I don't want to build empires alone," he said. "I want to build a life." Stella stepped into him, rested her forehead against his chest. "You already started," she whispered. "And I was building it too." The months that followed didn't feel like a fairy tale. They felt like continuity. Because love, for them, didn't come with fireworks. It came with trust baked into every morning routine. It came with laughing over typos in press releases. With sitting on opposite ends of a couch at midnight, laptops open, feet touching. It came with choosing each other, again and again, in rooms full of distractions, temptations, and noise. Stella didn't leave the company. She became its heart. Not because she held a title, but because her name meant integrity. Authenticity. She stood beside Peter in boardrooms, yes, but also in kitchens, in airports, in gardens, in life. They built businesses, yes, but they also built legacy. They hired ethically. They paid generously. They supported foundations for single mothers, for those who had to choose survival over education, like Stella once had. They became a story people whispered about in admiration, not just because they were powerful, but because they were real. A year after Peter had said she passed, he returned to that phrase, whispering it into Stella's hair as they danced slowly, alone in their penthouse, no music, just heartbeat and breath. "She passed," he said. "No," she whispered back. "We passed." And as the lights of the city flickered below, cold, distant, and endless, two warm hands clasped each other above it all. Not to control, not to possess, but to hold, to build, to love. And so they did, side by side. No longer a billionaire and a maid, but two humans, tested by life, bound by trust. And finally, free to be everything they never knew they were looking for. Together. Forever. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.